Welcome to this week's edition of the Weekly Travel Alert. I'm Steve Glenn.
I'm Paul Glenn.
And this week, Paul, I'm traveling to Asia, and it reminded me of all the things you have to do before you travel to Asia. We put together a list of the 10 top things you have to do before you get on that plane and head out into the wild blue yonder. So let's get started.
Sounds good.
The first headline in this week's Weekly Travel Alert reads, here is a list of the top 10 things to do before you travel internationally. And as I said, Paul, I'm getting on the plane. I'm flying from San Francisco to Singapore, 17-hour flight. Luckily, I have business class seats for that long a flight.
That's still a long flight.
Yeah, it's still a long flight. Then from there, I go into Bangkok, from Bangkok into New Delhi, India, then back around the world, back home in about a week. And it reminded me of all the things that I had to do to travel to Asia. And we want to tell our listeners about all the things that they need to do to prepare for those long trips. And sometimes many of these apply to even a trip to Europe or Canada or other international destinations.
I think some of this, once you come to understand this, it actually may change where you want to go with your travels, just because not all of it's pleasant.
No, it's not. Some of it's not fun. So here we're going to go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
All right.
The first one on the list reads, double check your passport to make sure that it does not expire at least 6 months from the date of your return flight. So I'm leaving now this next week, and I'm returning in a week. Now, I have to check my passport because if it expires before 6 months when I return, they won't let me go.
Yeah.
And I think you saw that too on your passport.
I did. Actually, mine's been out for renewal for 4 months now. So I think a key thing you want to look at is constantly monitor that. So that's a good thing to just check every time you're doing a trip, so you can put together that game plan for when do I have a window of 6 months potentially that I won't need this passport, so that you have time for that renewal as well.
I know a lot of our agents at Executive Travel often ask for a photocopy of their passport to double check, because most people aren't aware of that 6-month rule, that you have to get your passport renewed so it doesn't has less than 6 months use on it. And Paul, one of the things that, in addition to your passport, many people forget about a visa because you're not familiar with that. So if I'm going to India, it took me about a week to try to fill in the forms, send in the photographs, a letter from a sponsor that's going to sponsor me in India, and file a fee, $100 fee, to get a visa to travel to India. So before you travel internationally, you must check to see if a visa is required. Your travel advisor can help you with that. And actually next year, Europe is going to require a visa type of document before you can get into Europe.
Yeah, no, I think that's a key. We've had too many nightmare stories where people book their travel on their own, and then they get there and they're not allowed in because they don't have proper documentation. So that's one that is often overlooked, because as Americans, there are many places we can go that don't have those requirements, but there are many places in the world. So especially the more exotic you're getting, it's probably more likely that they're going to have additional requirements.
So 1A is make sure your passport has at least 6 months before it ends and you return home. And 1B is check for that visa, because many countries now are saying you've got to get approval for us to come into our country, and a visa is how that takes place. Number 2 in this week's Weekly Travel Alert, the headline reads, check what vaccinations will be required to visit the countries that you're going to visit. I'm going to visit India and Singapore and Bangkok. So that includes vaccinations for typhoid, for hepatitis A and B. So I have to have all these vaccinations. Plus, I got to get these tablets for malaria tablets to take before I get on the plane. And when I come back, I got to keep taking them for seven days. So please be careful. Check with your doctor. They'll tell you, hey, what countries are you going to? And they'll tell you, these are the vaccines we recommend. You know, I've got yellow fever vaccines. I do the flu shot before I always go. So I got to I got a sore left shoulder and a sore right shoulder this week.
That's the not so pleasant part of preparing for a trip like this is getting that. But it is very important because last thing you want to do is either while you're traveling or you bring something home that you didn't plan on bringing home as far as an illness.
You bet. The next item on this week's Weekly Travel Alert, the headline reads, check the local festivals and holidays. I know we were going to go to India and last week, and what we found out is we had to move our trip a week later because there was a major national holiday. Well, we're not aware of that in the U.S. What holidays are in India? So we were lucky to know that there was a festival going on. Everything shuts down. The factories aren't open, and that caused us to make some changes. If you think about it, the 4th of July isn't celebrated by any other countries. Thanksgiving isn't celebrated by other countries. So you've got Memorial Day wouldn't be celebrated by European countries. So you got all of our festivals and holidays that aren't celebrated, and people aren't aware of them. And the same goes with them.
Yeah, each country's going to have their own celebrations, and each country's also got the different religious holidays as well. So I know when you're traveling to places like Israel, they have certain things that there's nothing functioning on holy days and things like that. So it is something that has an impact. Even Rome, we're doing Rome here in a couple weeks, and one of the days of travel is a holiday. So the restaurant availability and transportation companies has been a challenge.
Yes, that's a good point. In Rome and Italy seems like they have a holiday every week, and Greece has 2 holidays a week.
Well, and I think with the Rome one, a big piece of it is some of the people that are going with us, have a religious connection to Vatican, and the Vatican won't be open that day. So just things like that could severely impact what your experience is.
The 4th headline in this week's Weekly Travel Alert reads, check to see if your preferred hotel is available before you book your airline tickets. I know I oftentimes use frequent flyer miles and vice versa. So I always check to see if the hotel I want to stay at is available to use those miles before I book my airline tickets. And oftentimes I book my airline tickets using miles as well. So I kind of check both ways before I press that purchase button.
And I think that's the puzzle, the game that you like to play is the frequent flyer game. So, but I think that is, the reality is anymore the hotel is a bigger expense item than the airline ticket ends up being, unless you're doing something international. But those pieces of the puzzle have an impact. So if you've got the miles, or if you've got a certain brand that you're wanting to make sure you're utilizing, make sure you get that and have that availability.
The 5th headline of this week's Weekly Travel Alert reads, check the State Department security alerts. Paul, the U.S. State Department has a website. You can go on and say, I'm going to Mexico. Are there any alerts? I'm going to Jamaica. I'm going to India. And it will tell you if they're rated 1, 2, 3, or 4 as far as the high security for those countries. And you and I have been surprised to find like Jamaica is saying do not travel there.
Yeah.
Mexico says beware because there's many areas in Mexico that are highly dangerous. Those types of things. So you should look at that before you decide and before you press that button that says purchase.
Yeah, and I think to that, recognizing, say, Jamaica for an example is, you can go there and you can enjoy it, but a key from my experiences there is, don't expect to go explore the local scene. Go there to stay on the property and utilize the beach and those types of things, the all-inclusive that many people would make that selection of a destination for. So there's a way to do it, but I think a key is always, and this is no matter where you're at, is have your eyes open. Don't put yourself into a rough situation.
The 6th headline in this week's edition of the Weekly Travel Alert reads, book your international airline tickets first. You always have to find if you can get there, and especially for a reasonable price. When I'm traveling into Asia, those tickets can run anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000 depending on the day you travel. If you move one day, it might get half price. So I always try to, once again, check all that out, make sure I can get there. and then from there build on to that itinerary, build the local transfers, because you have a little bit of flexibility, build those local places to stay along there. So
I think a key to that, going back to the prior one, number 4, is a lot of times when you are doing that international travel, different brands of hotels. So some of those pieces aren't as critical as when you're doing something domestic and you're trying to stick with those brands.
number 7 this week says check your cell phone to see that it can provide international service to the countries you're traveling to. Literally, I call my cell phone company, Paul, and say, I'm going to India. Do I have cell service that is turned on there? And I also purchased the $5 a month international feature, and it cost me $10 a day to use my cell phone. But call your cell phone company, tell them to turn on that international feature to make sure you don't get to that country and can't use your phone.
Well, and I think in addition to that, just the awareness of, even when you do that $10 a day, that does limit you in many countries to how much data access you have via cellular. So if you're a guy like us that we tend to work while we're on the road, you do get to a point where the speed of that is not going to maintain. So you still want to have the plan B with Wi-Fi and a computer.
The next headline in this week's Weekly Travel Alert reads, get all your bells and whistles early. Paul, I often have to have my converter, my adapter for my electrical, recharging my batteries, my cell phone, my computer, and I need to prepare that before I go, not when I get there.
Yeah, no, I think the great examples we always hear about people taking their, I don't have to deal with this, but say curling irons for their hair, and they go find a plug-in over in Europe that it'll fit into, but the amperage is different, and so they come back frustrated because they burned off their hair instead of being prepared. So you don't want to end up that way.
I actually had a friend who had that happen to her and put a curling iron in her hair at a 220 versus a 110, and she was
wasn't
screaming.
pretty.
No,
Wasn't pretty.
And it didn't smell good either. So the 9th item in this week's Weekly Travel Alert, ladies and gentlemen, reads, buy travel insurance. If you're going to invest $5,000, $10,000 in a trip, and you have something medically happens, you got to go to the hospital, guess what? Your health insurance in the States isn't going to cover it. So you better have travel insurance. If you fall off a bicycle and break a leg, you got to have that repaired. And some of these places require you to pay before they'll fix it.
And that's actually post-COVID, that's been something that's changed because there are many countries that actually require proof of travel insurance. So if you would have something go awry, they have a guarantee that the medical facilities down there will get paid. So that's something that's actually changed pretty dramatically. But it also, I know you've had to use this many, many years ago, but if something happens to a loved one back home, it will reimburse you for what you had to miss of your trip, as well as getting you back to where you need to be to take care of whatever needs to happen for that loved one.
We're fortunate that during COVID, we had dozens upon dozens of people that had travel insurance, were able to get compensated for the loss of that trip. Just like you said, they caught COVID in the middle of the trip and had to get home. So the last item on this week's Weekly Travel Alert reads, set an appointment with a friendly travel advisor. Paul, this we saved the best for last. Of course, this sounds a little self-serving, but the reality of it is, why wouldn't you find a great travel coach? Why wouldn't you find somebody that will watch after you, that will coach you, advise you how to do it, try to find ways to save you money, make it easier, press the easy button with a great travel advisor?
I always go back to, a couple weeks back I was traveling and there were some weather issues around the country, and I'm walking through the Denver airport and I see the customer service counter and there's a line 200 people long. So, just having the ability to call that travel advisor instead of having to go stand in that line, that's, I don't know why you wouldn't appreciate what that brings to the table, because now all of a sudden you jumped the line of those 200 people because somebody's working on your behalf while the rest of them are standing there. So I think that's key. But I do have to hit you. You missed one. And that is, make sure you call your credit card companies.
Oh, yes.
And let them know where you're going to be traveling, the dates you're going to be traveling, because the last thing you want to do is get over there. You've got all these plans lined up. You go to pay and maximize that experience, and that credit card comes back declined, because in today's world, unfortunately, there's so much fraud, and a lot of that fraud is done internationally, because the laws are make it so that they're less likely to get in trouble if they're doing that internationally. So let your credit card companies know when and where you're going.
That's this week's edition of the Weekly Travel Alert. Thank you for joining us as we shared our top 11 tips that you must do before you travel internationally. I'm Steve Glenn.
I'm Paul Glenn. Please like, subscribe, share, and add any comments below on topics that you would like us to hit on in a future podcast. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week.